I'm Margaret Harrison. I am 72 years old. I run my life with an unreasonable fondness for old things, the scent of lemon oil on worn wood, Robert's pocket watch, a chipped saucer that still holds the ghost of his fingerprint. Until the week I was declared dead, I had everything most people think defines comfort: a steady routine, a small circle of friends, enough money that the worry of bills did not keep me up at night. My husband, Robert, made the fortune, brilliant, tireless, with a mind for code and markets. He left it to both of us, and to the idea that we would shape our later years with intention and a little luxury. I didn't expect betrayal to look so tidy. They called it the Margaret Project, a name I later found in printed folders tucked under rubber bands, notes in legal margins, a timeline penciled like a project manager's checklist. Phase 1, establish confusion. Phase 2, secure legal footing. Phase 3, accidental death. They had a spreadsheet for it. Spreadsheets are useful things. They can track the weather, or they can track hearts and wills. The morning started small, with a phone call. David's number lit my screen. His voice was warm in a way I wanted to believe was sincere. "Mom, we thought we might celebrate. You're getting back on your feet, and Vanessa made a reservation. Come out for a little cruise on the new boat. Nothing fancy, just us." His voice had the practiced cadence of a man who'd done this before, social niceties delivered with precision. He had reasons to sound right. He'd taken over rusted meetings, built a boutique consulting practice, and he wanted me to see what success in his generation looked like. I wanted to be a good mother who showed up. I had been recovering from hip replacement surgery, 6 weeks of carefully measured pain and physical therapy. I was still careful with stairs. I used a cane at times, but my mind was clear. Robert would have said, "If the bones heal, go live." The marina smelled of diesel and varnish when I arrived. The yacht was immaculate, gleaming white like a staged photograph. David greeted me with that well-rehearsed hug that tasted faintly of cologne and effort. Vanessa was already on deck, a champagne flute in hand, her smile a blade disguised as a courtesy. The first hour was a postcard: sunlight on the water, the ship's bell chiming like punctuation, laughter that seemed genuine in the way of people who practice being warm. Then the conversation shifted, subtly at first. Talk of wills, of simplifying the estate, and of my current mental state. Vanessa found a way to angle her phone to capture me speaking. I could feel it. The tilt. The quiet framing of footage intended to be used against me. It settled in my stomach like a stone. "You know, Mom, probate can be so terrible," David said, refilling my glass a little too eagerly. "You should consider letting us help manage things. It's just logistics." Logistics. It is always logistics, isn't it? The stripping of agency sounds polite until the hand is under your armpit, pushing. I stood up slowly. My hip protested, but my thoughts were sharp. "I think I'd like to go back to shore." Their faces shifted. The warmth drained. "Mom, we're only trying to help. We're worried. The surgeons mentioned some..." She glanced at a small card she had tucked into her clutch. "Some confusion since the operation." The shove was not violent in the way movies imagine a villain. It was practiced, precise, a calculated distaste for mess. Behind me, the ocean. Ahead, the deck. I felt air leave me in a rush. My dress was sucked under me. The water accepted me without prejudice. I remember the cold. I remember thinking for an absurd and immediate second of how Robert always sneezed and scolded me when I didn't wear a scarf. I kicked. I stripped off shoes that dragged at me like anchors. I surfaced and coughed, and the yacht was already a growing smudge against the horizon. They left. Minutes later, a small fishing boat cut through the glassy water and pulled me aboard. The man at the wheel was the kind you'd imagine in a folk tale: wind-creased skin, a laugh that rolled like rope, blue eyes that had seen 1,000 dawns. His name was Jake Morrison. He and his grandson, Tyler, wrapped me in blankets that smelled like boat varnish and yesterday's coffee. "Holy hell," he said, voice rough with concern. "Lady, you look like you took the wrong end out there." I told him enough. I told him they pushed me. I told him that I could not go to the Coast Guard. I could not let it be known that I lived. My son had already begun filling the world with the idea that I was fading, that my mind wandered. I could feel the net closing when I thought about the paper they had likely started to file, the probate wheels beginning to roll. They tried to kill me because they had already made the story. Jake knew how to keep secrets. He dropped me at Mrs. Chen's B&B, a place where cash was kindness, and no one looked too closely at reasons. Mrs. Chen is her own kind of moral clarity, a woman who has tended to hundreds of guests and learned the value in not asking for receipts on grief. She wrapped me in ordinary soup and ordinary practicality. "We don't ask why people come here," she said, sliding a steaming bowl into my hands. "We just make sure they're fed." While David and Vanessa were spinning a narrative about my presumed decline to whomever would listen, I had different work to do. I needed to know exactly how far the web of their deceit reached, who had access to my financials, who had been sending them information. Why had they been so careful that the people who should have been at my funeral, my financial advisor, my longtime attorney, were conspicuously absent? I had always trusted certain names. Robert had set up structures, trusted accounts, and advisors that gave me a comfortable winter. None of that mattered if someone inside the machinery decided to wink. The more I pulled at threads, the uglier the pattern unraveled. Bank officers who had once been friends became hesitant. Lawyers who had advised us suddenly were too busy to take my calls. At the same time, some details were odd in a way that would later prove crucial. My son making large purchases, a baby appearing in photographs where no one had mentioned a pregnancy, meetings at places that catered to discretion. Danny Crawford, was the instrument I hired to start turning suspicion into proof. He's the kind of man you dismiss as too ordinary to be interesting until you see how quietly brilliant he is. Mid-50s, face with a patient crease, the kind of person who looks like he's always cataloging small details. He listened without expression when I told him the story. He said, "We need to know their story. They're telling one to the world. We need to see what private pages say." With Danny working downtown, Jake watching the marina, Mrs. Chen making soup and pulling strings, and Carol, a nanny who turned out to be a woman with a kind heart and good instincts, I started to assemble a counterstory. The funeral they held was a ritual of the living for the benefit of actors. Empty casket, professional program, flowers the color of grief. David gave a speech that was all wonderful turns in public sorrow. Vanessa wept on cue. I sat in a car across the street with binoculars. Some of the sympathy was genuine. My neighbor Eleanor wept openly. My book club friends were there. But the people who handled the financial and legal end were missing. They had found ways to avoid the pageant that discloses the plan. At the graveside, Vanessa's eyes glittered with something I did not mistake for sorrow. It was the look of someone who admires their own work. I watched them accept condolences and then move people aside when anyone asked deeper questions. They were good at their roles. Later, in a house I once called mine, I found a file with the title that froze my breath: Project Margaret. It wasn't poetry. It was businesslike. It detailed staged incidents, doctored images, and a timeline with precise dates marked for escalation. It also mentioned a reference, initials MT. A name later would emerge, Miranda Torres, an estate planning consultant who specialized in family transition services. She was everything a predator wants, polite, professional, and surrounded by plausible excuses. That baby changed the game. The contract-like documents suggested a purchased heir, a newborn with a birth certificate made to fit the Harrison name, documents paid in cash, the involvement of a private reproductive clinic. A young woman named Sarah Collins appeared in the margins of these files, a name next to a number, and a blank space where compassion belonged. A nurse at the clinic, when pressed, told Danny there were oddities in Sarah's file. And then there was a delivery with complications. Records said death by unexpected cardiac arrest, but the nurse remembered a healthy teenager, bright-eyed and frightened, with no risk factors. Where there's a gap between paperwork and witnesses, evil likes to hide. We did not have proof of murder yet. We had enough circumstantial horror to drive me to stay hidden and to push Danny to dig. He surveilled, photographed, and cataloged. He found that David and Vanessa had been to the private clinic multiple times, that cash changed hands, and that a law partner, Miranda Torres, had been meeting with them repeatedly. Miranda's firm had taken an unusual interest in elderly clients with strained family ties. She would recommend solutions when people voiced concerns about their loved ones' incapacity, and she had a way of putting legal structure around those solutions. Danny's camera chronicled meetings in lobbies, coffee shops, and the private clinic's glass foyer. Another disturbing pattern. Patricia Walsh, an attorney who'd once been a trusted friend, showed up in several of Miranda's other cases. Names and faces overlapped, like the steps of a dance choreographed for bank accounts. I could have gone to the police then. I could have shouted from rooftops that my son and daughter-in-law were betraying me. But the police require evidence beyond suspicion. You can drown in the water between plausible deniability and justice. So we did the most dangerous but necessary thing. We built the evidence. We planted listening devices in the old house with Carol's help. Carol was the type who cried when she saw an animal in a short film and mended bandages on stray cats. She was a woman who loved a baby as if her own life depended on tenderness. When she opened her door to me and I told her I was Margaret, she nearly fainted. "But the papers," she whispered. I showed her the photographs Danny had taken and the papers from my break-in. She agreed to help without hesitation. She would, she said, protect that baby like it was the last secret she possessed. The plan we hatched was dramatic in ways I had not expected myself to accept. It was dangerous. It required me to allow them to think they'd succeeded so that when Miranda arrived to tidy the last morsel of evidence, to make sure there were no witnesses and no unexpected threads, the world would instead trap her in her own words. Danny had connections in places I would not have imagined. A bureau team quietly listening to patterns. Miranda Torres was not unknown to them. They had been watching, but they needed a clean opening to act. My being dead, my sudden return, my staged vulnerability created the opening. On the morning of the meeting, I rehearsed greeting a son who'd betrayed me. I practiced the neutral expression of a woman who, for the sake of catching a criminal, must wear the costume of the vanquished. I walked up the path to my old house at exactly 6. The door opened. David's face registered surprise, then something like fear. Vanessa's composure cracked. They told me Miranda would be here. I nodded, and we all went inside. Miranda arrived punctual, elegant, exactly what a person who makes people's lives legally simpler would be. She sat at my old dining table as if it belonged in her portfolio and spoke in that infuriatingly calm cadence of people who monetize grief. "We can close everything quickly," she said, "if you understand the benefits of a streamlined transition." She had a binder with case studies and client testimonials. She spoke of dignity and relief, two words that can be used as veneer. She described her process like a product: evaluation, documentation, legal restructuring. To her, the elderly were a market. People like me were units. And then she made the mistake of talking too much. It's a gamble that arrogance often makes. She basked in her success. She told us about her process, about how they convinced families that the subject had diminished capacity, about how certain physicians would sign off and how certain court people would, politely and slowly, create disparity where debt and influence were needed. I did not raise my voice. I let my small recorder sit on the table and capture every word. I let the FBI, who had been trailing Miranda's operations for months, listen in real time. It was a sting wrapped in my living room. Cameras that Carol had planted caught Miranda's gestures, facial expressions, the binder with the listing of cases that read like a killer's ledger. She confessed, in the way orderly people do when they think the audience is safe and pliant. When the agents moved in, the room transformed into something else, a place of law rather than a stage. Miranda tried to run. She bolted through the back, but she was intercepted. David and Vanessa were stunned, their faces turning to the color of guilt. They got arrested in my old living room, mid-sentence, as they tried to construct plausible deniability. The cleaner they'd hired to finish me died in a hotel room with a single gunshot wound before he could act. The network took its own measure and began cutting loose threads. It was terrifying and, in the way of complications, also merciful. What followed was not quick triumph. Law takes time. The dismantling of an operation that had blurred the lines between legal counsel and rampant greed required months of testimony, subpoenas, depositions, and hearings. Miranda's firm would be indicted on charges of racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, and elder abuse. Medical examiners who had been sloppy or worse, complicit, had to be confronted with whistleblowers and paper trails. Sometimes people who had been paid to look away chose to look, and when they did, the whole structure shuddered. There were hearings about my capacity, about the forged documents we found in the study, about the cash payments to the reproductive clinic, and the irregularity of Sarah Collins' death certificate. Prosecutors presented careful timelines: visits to specific facilities, bank transfers, emails, and texts that read like breadcrumbed confessions. Danny and the FBI had tapes, photographs, a web of witnesses that included nurses, a lab tech who remembered an unrecorded drug vial, and an estate paralegal who had been asked to produce quick documentation in exchange for a promised cut. David and Vanessa were arraigned. It was surreal to look at them through the glass panes of the courtroom. They looked smaller there. The sheen of their life withered to a set of charges: attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, accessory to murder, in the death of a young woman whose only real fault may have been trusting people who promised money and secrecy. The prosecution's case was compelling because of the evidence gathered by people who refused to be convenient. Miranda insisted at trial that she had only been a consultant, that she provided legal avenues for families stressed with caretaking. But the pattern spoke. Repeated cases where elderly clients with assets suddenly died or suffered incidents that were then followed by tidy transfers to the helpful family members, coupled with a private system of medical evaluations that served only to create convenient records. The courtroom was the kind of place where words feel like wooden furniture, functional, exact, and unmoving. Witnesses told stories of minor manipulations that led to major disappearances. The nurse, who remembered Sarah's delivery, gave testimony that made parts of the courtroom quiet enough to hear a pin drop. The judge read long days of testimony with a face that gives away little. When the guilty verdicts were appeared, they were measured. Vanessa pleaded guilty to a cluster of charges. David took a plea deal. Miranda was convicted and received life without the possibility of parole for her central organizing role. Justice arrived with its own shortcomings. No conviction could bring Sarah back. No sentence could erase those months I spent sleeping in borrowed rooms and rehearsing the voice of the bereaved. The baby, small and bright, needed a different kind of repair. We had to be careful to not invert one harm into another. The baby deserved truth and parents who would love him wholly, not as a repository for guilt. It took work to trace Sarah's family, to find kin who were willing to come forward after a lifetime of silence. We found them, finally, in a small community in Canada. A cousin who had changed his name and moved west. An aunt who had kept photographs in an attic because she could not remember how to say goodbye. In the end, the courts recognized that the child should not be defined by the people who had tried to purchase him. I petitioned for custody, not out of greed, but out of a responsibility that felt fierce and clear. I wanted him to grow up knowing the truth, who his birth mother was, why she had made the choices she did, and the awful cost those choices exacted. It took work to trace Sarah's family, to find kin who were willing to come forward after a lifetime of silence. We found them, finally, in a small community in Canada. A cousin who had changed his name and moved west. An aunt who had kept photographs in an attic because she could not remember how to say goodbye. In the end, the courts recognized that the child should not be defined by the people who had tried to purchase him. I petitioned for custody, not out of greed, but out of a responsibility that felt fierce and clear. I wanted him to grow up knowing the truth, who his birth mother was, why she had made the choices she did, and the awful cost those choices exacted. It took months of hearings, of social workers and home visits, and of testimony that balanced my rights with the community's concerns. The judge, a woman who had made a career of balancing paper and human frailty, listened to our case and granted the adoption in a ruling that felt like a benediction. The child would have a name that honored both lives he had inherited: Robert Sarah Harrison. Robert, for the grandfather whose legacy the family had tried to exploit. Sarah, for the young woman who had given everything in the belief that she had helped the family.
Years later, when the legal dust settled, we were still a strange little family. I became his grandmother in practice and in law. I watched him learn to throw and to read the way a tree takes time to root. He learned about his birth mother as a story, explained without bitterness. Sarah Collins, brave and small, who had a hole in her life the way some people have missing teeth. He learned not to revere the money that had been at the heart of the scheme, but to see it as a lesser part of a historical narrative. He learned to be kind, because kindness was what had rescued him: a fisherman's quick eye, a nanny's hidden camera, a grandmother's insistence that truth be heard. The aftermath of something like this is a long season of adjustment. I have lawyer meetings that are less frequent now. My finances are in more secure hands, thanks to new people who were horrified at the idea that a system could be gamed like that. I speak sometimes to elder advocacy groups about what happened, about how organized exploitation of vulnerable elders can be subtle and embedded in seemingly legitimate professional systems. My voice in those rooms is small but precise. It is a thing I do because living through something gives an obligation to tell the truth for others. I also found more gentle things. Mrs. Chin continues to make soup the way she always did, and people travel to her bed and breakfast now because they heard the story and wanted to meet the woman in the middle who knows how to keep a secret. Jake goes back out to sea, but he teaches young men to be better fishermen and to watch out for boats that don't look right. Danny went back to the bureau eventually. He receives a Christmas card from me every year. He calls sometimes, and when he does, he doesn't talk about the arrests. He talks like someone who has seen too much and learned that the best revenge is to keep doing the right thing. Sometimes in the quiet evening, when the sun draws long shadows across the porch, I look out at the harbor and think about the economics of greed. Greed is not just an individual failing. It is a set of practices, social agreements that slip when money gets big enough and the moral muscle atrophies through neglect. Robert and I built a life in which generosity was possible. My son and his wife were allowed to imagine there were shortcuts. That is the sorrow. But then there is also the astonishing truth. Ordinary people, a fisherman, a bed and breakfast owner, a nanny, a patient investigator, and a few honest nurses can make the difference between a ledger entry and a life. I do not pretend to be unscathed. I lost a son to choices that were monstrous, and I awake sometimes in the night with the outline of betrayal etched like an ache. There are moments of small joy, too. The way Robert Sarah, he's 8 now, laughs when his cereal wants to escape the bowl. How he insists that every Sunday we read a book about a brave girl named Sarah, and how he asks difficult questions that remind me there is goodness in curiosity. If you ask me for a moral, I would offer only this. Family is not a guarantee. It is not a contract that comes tied to blood. It is an active project of building trust, of refusing to let ledger books tell us who matters. And sometimes when the world pushes you under, there are enough good people who will pull you out. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you. Share it if you think someone should hear it. Subscribe if you want to follow along. And remember, keep your important documents tight. Have more than one trusted advisor, and don't be afraid to question anyone who seems overly eager to help you with things that belong only to you. Margaret Harrison.